What if I told you that the very thing you're afraid to lose is the exact thing keeping you from becoming who you're meant to be? Right now, as you listen to these words, there's something in your life you're gripping so tightly that your knuckles have gone white. Maybe it's a relationship that ended years ago, a version of yourself you can no longer be, or a dream that's slowly suffocating under the weight of your desperate need to control it. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who mapped the deepest territories of the human psyche, discovered something profound about this tendency we all share. He found that what we refuse to let go of doesn't just stay with us, it begins to possess us, shaping our choices, our relationships, and our very sense of who we are in ways we never consciously intended. If this truth cuts through something inside you, if you've felt that familiar ache of holding on too tightly, then subscribe to this channel. We explore the psychological and spiritual territories that others are afraid to enter, and today we're going deeper than most are willing to go. The art of letting go is not what most people think it is. It's not passive resignation or spiritual bypassing. It's not about becoming emotionally numb or pretending that loss doesn't hurt. According to Carl Jung's revolutionary understanding of the human psyche, letting go is actually one of the most psychologically sophisticated and spiritually mature acts we can perform. It requires us to face the deepest parts of ourselves, to confront what Jung called our shadow, and to surrender our ego's desperate need for control in service of something far more profound, what he termed the process of individuation. Jung understood that human beings are not static creatures. We are dynamic, evolving systems, constantly moving towards psychological wholeness, but only if we're willing to release what no longer serves this deeper becoming. The problem is that most of us have been conditioned to believe that holding on is strength and letting go is weakness. Jung's work reveals the opposite. He showed us that our attachment to outdated versions of ourselves, to relationships that have run their course, to dreams that were never truly ours, actually blocks the natural flow of psychological energy that wants to move us toward our authentic self. Today we're going to explore 4 profound dimensions of letting go through Jung's lens. We'll discover why your psyche is designed for release, how your shadow holds the keys to true freedom, why impermanence is not your enemy but your teacher, and how the deepest letting go opens you to what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between who you've been and who you're becoming. Chapter 1. The Psychology of Attachment. Why we cling. To understand the art of letting go, we must first understand why human beings cling so desperately to things, people, and identities that no longer serve them. Jung's exploration of the psyche reveals that our attachments are rarely about the object itself. They're about what that object represents to our ego's sense of security and identity. The ego in Jungian psychology is not the enemy that Eastern spirituality sometimes makes it out to be. It's actually a necessary structure, the center of our conscious personality that helps us navigate the world. But the ego has one fundamental flaw. It believes it needs to control everything in order to survive. This creates what Jung observed as a psychological paradox. The more tightly we grasp, the more we actually diminish our capacity for genuine security and growth. Think about someone you know who's been stuck in the same patterns for years. Maybe they stay in jobs that drain their soul, because leaving would mean facing the uncertainty of who they might become. Perhaps they remain in relationships that stopped growing long ago because being alone would force them to confront parts of themselves they've been avoiding. Or consider how many people cling to past versions of themselves, constantly telling stories about who they used to be rather than embracing who they're becoming. Jung discovered that this clinging behavior often stems from what he called complexes, autonomous clusters of psychic energy that operate outside our conscious control. When we have an unresolved complex around abandonment, for instance, we might cling to relationships not out of love but out of an unconscious terror of being left alone. When we have complexes around worthiness, we might hold on to achievements, possessions, or social status, not because they truly fulfill us, but because they provide a fragile sense of value. The psychological cost of this clinging is enormous. Jung observed that when we refuse to let go of what needs to be released, our psychic energy becomes bound up in maintaining illusions rather than flowing toward growth and authentic expression. We become what he called unconscious, not because we lack awareness, but because our awareness is trapped in service of maintaining psychological structures that no longer serve our development. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. The psyche is naturally designed for release. Just as the body knows how to heal a wound by letting go of damaged tissue, the psyche knows how to heal psychological wounds by releasing attachments that have become toxic. The problem is that most of us have never been taught to trust this natural process. We've been conditioned to believe that we must consciously control every aspect of our psychological experience, when actually the deepest healing happens when we learn to collaborate with the psyche's natural wisdom. This is where Jung's understanding becomes revolutionary. He realized that what we call letting go is not actually something we do. It's something we allow. It's the removal of the ego's interference with a natural psychological process that wants to happen anyway. When we stop frantically grasping, when we release our white-knuckled grip on people and situations and identities that have served their purpose, we create space for what Jung called the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, to guide us toward our next stage of development. Chapter 2. Meeting Your Shadow. The parts you've refused to release. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Jung's approach to letting go involves confronting what he termed the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we've disowned, rejected, or refused to acknowledge. Most people think of the shadow as the dark parts of their personality, but Jung's understanding was far more nuanced. The shadow contains not just our repressed negative qualities, but also our unlived potentials, our rejected gifts, and the parts of ourselves we've been too afraid to express. Here's what makes the shadow so relevant to letting go. We cannot truly release anything until we've first acknowledged what we're actually holding on to, and often, what we're clinging to most desperately are not external things, but internal identities that keep our shadow material safely hidden from consciousness. We hold on to being the good person, the successful person, the spiritual person, not because these identities serve our authentic development, but because they allow us to avoid confronting the parts of ourselves that don't fit these narrow definitions. Consider Sarah, a woman who spent decades clinging to her identity as the family caretaker. On the surface, this seemed like a noble role, always putting others' needs before her own, always being the one everyone could depend on. But when Sarah began exploring her shadow through Jungian analysis, she discovered that her compulsive caretaking was actually a way of avoiding her own needs, her own anger, her own desire to be cared for. The parts of herself that wanted to receive, to be selfish sometimes, to express frustration, these had all been banished to the shadow. Her inability to let go of her caretaker identity was actually her unconscious way of keeping these threatening parts of herself locked away. Jung discovered that our shadow often contains the very qualities we need to develop in order to move forward in our psychological development. The person who's always been nice might need to access their capacity for healthy anger. The individual who's identified with being rational might need to embrace their emotional and intuitive side. The one who's been the strong person might need to learn to be vulnerable and ask for help. But here's the challenge. Integrating shadow material requires letting go of the ego identities we've used to keep the shadow repressed. This is why genuine letting go often feels like a kind of death. In a very real psychological sense, it is a death. The death of limited versions of ourselves that we've outgrown but haven't yet had the courage to release. Jung called this process shadow work, and he understood it as essential to psychological maturity. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, it doesn't disappear. It becomes projected outward onto other people, or it manifests as symptoms, compulsions, or self-sabotaging behaviors. The businessman who can't let go of his workaholic identity might be avoiding his shadow need for rest and intimacy. The spiritual seeker who clings to being above worldly concerns might be rejecting their shadow capacity for ambition and material success. The path through this involves what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of choosing between the light and dark aspects of ourselves, we learn to contain both, to let go of the need to be purely one thing or another. This is profoundly liberating because it means we no longer have to maintain exhausting psychological vigilance, constantly monitoring ourselves to make sure we're only expressing the acceptable parts of our personality. When we begin to integrate our shadow, something remarkable happens to our capacity for letting go. We discover that we were often clinging to things not because we genuinely valued them, but because releasing them would have forced us to confront rejected aspects of ourselves. The person who can't let go of a toxic relationship might actually be avoiding their shadow capacity for solitude and independence. The individual who holds on to material possessions might be rejecting their shadow acceptance of life's fundamental insecurity. Jung found that as people became more conscious of their shadow, their natural capacity for letting go emerged organically. They no longer needed to force themselves to release attachments. They simply found that many of the things they'd been grasping no longer held the same psychological charge. This is because once we've integrated the shadow material that was driving our attachments, those attachments often lose their compulsive quality and transform into conscious choices. Chapter 3. The Impermanence Principle. Death as Teacher. Jung's approach to letting go was profoundly influenced by his understanding of what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to bridge opposites and move toward greater wholeness. One of the most fundamental opposites we must learn to navigate is the tension between permanence and impermanence, between our desire for security and the reality that everything in life is constantly changing. Unlike many Western approaches to psychology that focus primarily on building ego strength and achieving stability, Jung understood that psychological health actually requires developing what we might call fluidity intelligence, the capacity to flow with life's natural rhythms of creation and destruction, attachment and release, death and rebirth. He observed that people who struggled most with letting go were often those who had developed an unconscious fantasy that they could somehow exempt themselves from the fundamental law of impermanence. This resistance to impermanence often manifests in what Jung called inflation, an unconscious identification with archetypal energies that makes us feel larger than life, immune to ordinary human limitations. The person who can't let go of their youth might be inflated with the eternal child archetype. The individual who clings to past achievements might be possessed by what Jung called the hero complex. The one who refuses to release control might be inflated with the archetype of the king or queen. But Jung discovered something profound about death and endings that most people miss. He found that what we call death in psychological terms is often not actually an ending but a transformation, a movement from one form of consciousness to another. The problem is that the ego, which can only perceive from its limited perspective, experiences all transformation as death and therefore resists it with every fiber of its being. Consider Michael, a successful executive who went through what others called a midlife crisis, but what was actually a profound individuation process. For 20 years, he had built his identity around climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth and status. When he hit his 40s, he began feeling an inexplicable emptiness, a sense that his life lacked meaning despite his external success. His first instinct was to cling harder to what he'd built, to work longer hours, to acquire more possessions, to prove to himself that his chosen path was still valid. But Jung's understanding suggests that Michael's emptiness was not a problem to be solved, but a message from his deeper self, indicating that he had outgrown his previous identity and was ready for the next stage of his psychological development. The death of his identity as purely a successful businessman was actually making space for a more integrated version of himself to emerge, one that could include his business success while also honoring other aspects of his nature that had been neglected. Jung called this kind of psychological death voluntary suffering and distinguished it from neurotic suffering. Neurotic suffering happens when we resist the natural flow of psychological development, when we cling to outdated versions of ourselves and refuse to let the natural death-rebirth cycle occur. Voluntary suffering, on the other hand, happens when we consciously cooperate with this process, when we choose to let go, even when it's frightening, trusting that something more authentic wants to emerge. The profound insight Jung offers here is that death, whether literal or psychological, is not the opposite of life, but its completion. Every ending contains within it the seeds of a new beginning, but only if we're willing to release our grip on what's dying. When we cling to relationships that have run their course, we prevent both ourselves and the other person from moving into whatever wants to emerge next. When we hold on to identities we've outgrown, we block the natural flow of our own becoming. Jung found that people who learned to work consciously with impermanence actually became more alive, not less. They developed what he called psychological resilience, not the kind that resists change, but the kind that flows with it. They discovered that underneath their ego's terror of endings was a deeper wisdom that trusted the process of psychological death and rebirth. This doesn't mean becoming fatalistic or passive. Jung's approach involves what he called active engagement with the unconscious, consciously participating in our own transformation rather than being dragged through it unconsciously. We learn to sense when something in our life is ready to die, to recognize the psychological equivalent of autumn leaves that are ready to fall, and we develop the courage to release them consciously, with gratitude for what they've provided, and trust in what wants to emerge. Chapter 4. The Transcendent Function, Becoming Who You Really Are. The ultimate goal of Jungian letting go is not emptiness, but fullness. Not the absence of attachment, but what Jung called conscious relationship. This brings us to perhaps his most sophisticated psychological concept, the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to synthesize opposites and move toward greater wholeness. Jung discovered that when we learn to let go skillfully, we don't lose our capacity for connection and engagement. We actually enhance it. This is because true letting go removes the neurotic, compulsive quality from our attachments while preserving their essential vitality. We move from unconscious clinging to conscious choosing, from desperate grasping to grateful receiving. The transcendent function emerges when we learn to hold paradox without collapsing into one side or the other. We can love deeply while accepting impermanence. We can engage fully while remaining unattached to outcomes. We can commit wholeheartedly while staying open to change. This requires what Jung called psychological sophistication, the capacity to tolerate ambiguity and complexity without rushing to premature closure. Consider Elena, a woman who spent years struggling with the end of her 20-year marriage. Initially, she oscillated between two extremes, either fighting desperately to save the relationship or cutting off all emotional connection to protect herself from pain. Both responses, Jung would suggest, were ego-driven attempts to avoid the complexity of her actual situation. Through working with Jung's concepts, Elena began to develop what he called the transcendent attitude. She learned to hold both her love for her ex-husband and her acceptance that their marriage had ended. She could feel grief for what was lost, while simultaneously feeling gratitude for what had been shared. She discovered that she could let go of the marriage while maintaining appreciation for the growth it had facilitated in both of them. This is what Jung meant by the transcendent function, the capacity to find the third way that transcends the limitations of either-or thinking. Instead of choosing between attachment and detachment, we learn conscious relationship. Instead of choosing between engagement and withdrawal, we discover what Jung called detached involvement, full participation without neurotic clinging. The transcendent function also involves what Jung called the union of opposites within ourselves. As we integrate our shadow material and learn to let go of one-sided identities, we become more psychologically complete. The person who was always strong learns to embrace vulnerability. The individual who was perpetually giving develops the capacity to receive. The one who was chronically rational integrates their emotional and intuitive intelligence. This integration creates what Jung called psychological gold, a transformed personality that contains and synthesizes previously conflicting aspects of the self. We become more flexible, more resilient, more capable of responding appropriately to whatever life presents, rather than reacting from rigid psychological patterns. But perhaps most importantly, the transcendent function connects us to what Jung called the self with a capital S, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche that's larger than our ego consciousness. The self, in Jung's understanding, is not just personal but transpersonal, connected to what he called the collective unconscious and the archetypal patterns that shape human experience across cultures and centuries. When we learn to let go from this deeper perspective, we're not just releasing personal attachments, we're aligning ourselves with the fundamental creative force of the universe itself. We become participants in what Jung called the opus, the great work of psychological and spiritual transformation that's happening not just within us, but through us. This creates a profound shift in how we experience letting go. Instead of feeling like loss or failure, release becomes a form of creative participation in life's continuous unfolding. We begin to sense when something is ready to be released, not because we should let go, but because holding on would interfere with the natural flow of psychological energy that wants to move us toward greater wholeness. Jung found that people who developed this relationship with the transcendent function often reported feeling more alive and purposeful than ever before, even as they simultaneously felt less attached to specific outcomes. They discovered what mystics across traditions have pointed toward, that true freedom comes not from getting what we want, but from wanting what arises, from learning to dance with life rather than trying to control it. Carl Jung's revolutionary understanding of letting go reveals that what most of us think of as release is actually the gateway to becoming more fully ourselves than we ever imagined possible. Through his lens, we discover that our attachments are not just personal preferences, but psychological defenses against the natural flow of individuation, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness. The art of letting go, as Jung understood it, is not about becoming empty, but about becoming spacious enough to contain the full complexity of human experience. It's about releasing the ego's desperate need to control so that the deeper wisdom of the self can guide our lives. It's about integrating our shadow so that we're no longer unconsciously driven by rejected aspects of our personality. And it's about embracing impermanence as a teacher, rather than an enemy, understanding that every ending contains within it the seeds of a new beginning. When we learn to let go from this Jungian perspective, we don't lose our capacity for love, commitment, and engagement. Instead, we discover forms of connection that are more authentic because they're no longer driven by unconscious fear, manipulation, or the ego's need for security. We learn to love without possessing, to commit without clinging, to engage without losing ourselves in what we're engaged with. Perhaps most importantly, Jung's approach to letting go connects us to something larger than our personal psychology. It aligns us with what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to synthesize opposites and move toward greater wholeness. When we learn to release from this deeper place, we become conscious participants in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. The path Jung points toward is not easy, but it is profoundly liberating. It requires the courage to face our shadow, the wisdom to embrace impermanence, and the faith to trust that who we're becoming is more authentic than who we've been. But for those willing to walk this path, Jung offers something invaluable: the possibility of a life lived in conscious relationship with the deepest creative forces of existence. If these insights have touched something in you, if you recognize yourself in this exploration of psychological letting go, then leave a comment below. Share your own experience with release and transformation. And if you feel called to continue this journey into the depths of the psyche, subscribe to walk with us deeper into the mysteries of the mind, soul, and the continuous becoming that Jung called individuation. The path of conscious letting go awaits, and it leads not to emptiness but to the fullness of who you truly are.